And then Matthew in this genealogy does an even stranger thing. He inserts 4 women into the genealogy of Jesus. Nobody did that in a patriarchal age. Women weren't even thought to be contributors to the genetic life of the newborn. A woman was sort of a rented womb. She made no contribution. We didn't discover that women had an egg cell until the first quarter of the 18th century, sometime around 1720. That's when we began to recognize that every child, every life that's ever been born, receives an equal genetic content from mother and father, that women are co-creators of every life that's ever lived. And that, I think, is the moment when women began their march into equality. But anyway, these women, Matthew puts them in the genealogy. And that's our first surprise. And our next surprise is that these women are all, by the standards of that day, fallen women. And he names them. And anybody can go into the Old Testament and read their stories, but few people do. So let me take you into the stories of these 4 fallen women. I call them the shady ladies of Matthew's genealogy. The first one was a woman named Tamar. Judah had 3 sons. One was named one was named Onan, and one was named Shelah. Shelah was much younger than the first 2 boys. And Judah, as a typical husband or father in a patriarchal age, picked out Tamar to be married to his oldest son. And after the marriage, before any children were born, Judah's son dies. There must have been some whispers that maybe Tamar is dangerous. But according to the laws of the Jewish world, if your brother dies, the next oldest son has the responsibility to marry his brother's widow and to raise up children to his brother's name. So Tamar becomes the wife of Onan. But Onan dies, and the text is very clear. God killed him. But the rumor was that maybe Tamar had something to do with it. And besides that, Shelah, the next oldest son, was only 7 or 8 years old, and he had no great interest in marrying Tamar. And so Judah says to his daughter-in-law, Shelah is too young to be your husband. I have no other sons. You have to go back to your father's house and come under his protection. It was a denigrating thing, a shameful thing for a woman to have to do. She was now damaged goods in that society. But she goes back, and Shelah begins to grow up. And then the story says Judah became a widower. His wife died, and he entered a period of mourning. Then after that period of mourning was over, Judah had to do some business in a nearby village, something with sheep shearing. And so he plans a journey to that village, and Tamar, who hears that her father-in-law is coming on business to that city or that village, decides to set a trap for him. So she puts on the garments of a prostitute, and she covers her face, and she sits in the gate of the city. And when Judah walks in, he sees this prostitute. And his period of mourning is over, so he feels frisky. And so he goes over to this prostitute, and he contracts with her to provide him with the service she is offering. And they haggle about a price. And Judah says, well, I'll send you a kid by my servant tomorrow. This is a wise woman. She says, how do I know you'll do that? Give me something that'll be your bond, your surety. What would you like, says Judah. And she says, I'll take your signet ring and the girdle that you wrap around yourself and your staff. And so the contract is entered. They perform their act together. she keeps these 3 parts of his clothing. And Judah goes on about his business. The next day, Judah, true to his word, sends one of his servants with a kid, the payment, and to redeem his products, his ring, his rope, his staff. This man gets to that village and looks for the prostitute who does business at the gate, and she's not there. So he says, "Where is that prostitute that was at the gate of the city?" And the people say, "Oh, we don't have any prostitutes in this city." And he searches for her and he can't find her, so he returns with the kid. And Judah says, "Well, I guess I'll just lose those pieces of my clothing, but let it be." And 3 months pass. And Tamar discovers she's pregnant. And Judah hears that his daughter-in-law is pregnant. He feels family shame. And he's going to exercise the law. And so he carries her forward and says she must be burned at the stake. She's a prostitute. She's a whore. And so they bring Tamar out and they prepare to build a fire. And just before they light the flames, Tamar says, "Oh, by the way, you might be interested to know that the father of my baby is the owner of this ring and this rope and this staff." Pretty dramatic story. And Judah recognizes them as his own. And he sees that he's treated her very unjustly. And so despite the fact that for a father-in-law to take a daughter-in-law to be his wife was considered incest in that society, he takes Tamar into his harem as one of his wives. And she has twins. And one is named Perez, and one is named Zerah. You can read that story in Genesis 38. It's right out of the Bible. And Matthew says it was through Perez that the line that produced Jesus of Nazareth flowed. It was through what the culture considered an incestuous relationship that Jesus was destined to be born. That's the first woman in the genealogy. The second woman in the genealogy is a woman named Rahab. You'll find her story in the book of Joshua, particularly Joshua 1 and Joshua 6. She was a prostitute. She worked in the red light district of Jericho. And Joshua's soldiers went in to her home and were protected. And as a quid pro quo for her protection, the soldiers of Joshua agreed that Rahab would be protected when the Jews conquered Jericho. And not just her, but her family. And when the walls came tumbling down and the Jewish troops went in and conquered, they sought out the house of the prostitute. They went into the red light district and they rescued her and all of her family. And she married one of Joshua's soldiers, a man named Shalman. And they had a baby boy, and his name was Boaz. What is Matthew saying? In these 17 verses, he's saying the line that produced Jesus of Nazareth traveled through the incest of Tamar and the prostitution of Rahab. And then the third woman appears. Her name is Ruth. You can read her story in the little book of Ruth, but please don't skip the 3rd chapter. Naomi is married to a Jewish man named Elimelech. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. There's a downturn in the Jewish economy, and jobs are scarce, and so they migrate to the land of Moab looking for work. And they live in Moab for about 10 years, but Elimelech dies. And so Mahlon and Chilion are responsible for this family. And they both marry Moab girls. One's named Opar, not Oprah, but Opar. And the other is named Ruth. And then both of these males die, Chilion and Mahlon. And so this family is left, a fragile family in a patriarchal world, a mother-in-law and 2 daughters-in-law. And Naomi says to these 2 girls, I don't have any more babies in my womb. I cannot raise up husbands for you. Your only choice is that you must go back to your father's house, again in shame. And Orpah does that. But Ruth refuses to leave. She says, I'm going to stay with you, my mother-in-law. And she sings words that we still use in marriage ceremonies from time to time, a beautiful song, the Song of Ruth. Entreat me not to leave thee. Whither thou goest, I will go. Thy people will be my people, thy God will be my God, and where you die, I will die, and where you buried, I will be buried. The Song of Ruth. I love to have it sung at a wedding because nobody knows that Ruth's talking to her mother-in-law, not to her lover. And I suspect that if some of the grooms realized who the object of that affection was, they might also have some qualms. But then you have a family of 2 fragile women in a patriarchal society with no way of earning a living. But Ruth commits herself to care for her mother-in-law, Naomi. So they go back to the land of the Jews. And the only thing they can do is that the Jewish farmers were required to leave some grain in the field for the poor. So every day, Ruth is in the fields, gleaning whatever wheat is available to keep her mother-in-law and herself alive. And she wins the respect of people because of her caring for her mother-in-law. And guess who owns the land where this gleaning is taking place? It's a man named Boaz that we met a little earlier. And Naomi is a wily woman. She knows that Boaz is a distant relative of her deceased husband and therefore a distant relative of Ruth's deceased husband. And that maybe he has the responsibility under Jewish law to marry the widow of his nearest of kin. And so Naomi plots her strategy. They're going to have a harvest festival at the end of the season. And she knows that wine is going to flow freely. This is chapter 3. So she instructs Ruth to go down to the river and bathe herself and use her best perfume and put on her best dress and go to the harvest festival. And she says, watch out for an opportunity when Boaz is well drunk. So about midnight, Boaz is on the floor, out cold. And Ruth puts a pillow under his head, puts a blanket over him, and then she crawls under the blanket with him. And the next morning, see, this is a Bible story you're not going to learn in Sunday school. The next morning, Boaz wakes up, and here's this woman under his blanket with him, and he has no earthly idea what he's done during the night. And he says, who are you? And she says, marry me. And then she reminds him that he has an obligation because he's a kinsman of her husband. Well, Boaz is not real eager. He says, surely there's somebody closer kin than I am. So he goes and tries to find this person. And he declines. So Boaz does the honorable thing. He marries Ruth. And they have a son. And his name is Obed. And he's the father of Jesse. And Jesse is the father of David. And what Matthew is saying is that the line that produced Jesus of Nazareth flowed through the incest of Tamar, the prostitution of Rahab, the seduction of Ruth, and there's one more woman in the genealogy. She's not even named. She's called the wife of Uriah. But anybody who knows the biblical story knows that the wife of Uriah is someone named Bathsheba. Bathsheba's story is this. David lived in the biggest house in Jerusalem because he was the king. So when he went out onto the roof of his house, he could see the roofs of every other house. One day in the late afternoon, he went out on his rooftop, and below him, a couple of blocks away, was an exquisitely beautiful woman taking a bath on her rooftop in what she thought was her privacy. David was smitten with her charms. And he sent a messenger to Bathsheba, inviting her to come and have a tryst with the king. And she came. Whether she had any choice in the matter would be an interesting thing to try to discover. But when the king commands, in that society, a woman had to respond. But she comes, and they have a tryst. It doesn't last but an hour or so. And then she goes back. My guess is it was not the first or the last of such activities that King David engaged in. He's supposed to have had about 300 wives, some of whom were concubines. And I suspect old King David forgot about it. But a few months later, he gets a message for the king's eyes only. And it says, "Dear king, there's something you need to know. I'm pregnant, and you're the father." And David says, "Oh, this can't be possible. Isn't that woman married? How does she know I'm the father?" And she sends back, "Yes, of course I'm married, but you need to know that my husband Uriah is in your army, and he's been out on maneuvers against your enemies for the last 6 months. You are the father." So the king says, "Well, I've got to go to plan B." So he sends a message to his army captain, a man named Joab, and says, "I want you to grant Uriah the Hittite an emergency furlough so he can come home. Spend a week or so. And then we'll just say the baby came early." Won't be the first time that story has ever been used. So Uriah, incredulous, doesn't understand why he's being granted a furlough, comes home. And the king meets with him. But what the king didn't anticipate is that Uriah was the original Boy Scout. And Uriah said, "Oh, it would not be fitting for me to enjoy the privileges of my wife's bed and the comforts of my home when all my buddies are fighting, bleeding, and dying in the foxholes in battle." So in identification with them, he set up a pup tent at the front of his house and very ostentatiously slept there. And King David said, "What a turkey." So David had to go to plan C. This all in the Bible. Plan C, David wrote out orders to send to Captain Joab, suggesting that they organize a flying wedge and go against the wall of the capital city of their enemy, and that Uriah be put at the point of the wedge. And Joab complied, and Uriah was struck down dead. And Joab sent a message back to the king, "Your problems are all taken care of." And the king sent for Bathsheba and invited her into his harem, and she came. And David and Bathsheba had a son, and his name was Solomon, and he became the successor to King David. Matthew in the genealogy is saying the line that produced Jesus of Nazareth flowed through the incest of Tamar, the prostitution of Rahab, the seduction of Ruth, and the adultery of Bathsheba. What do you suppose Matthew was trying to communicate? And why haven't we read these 17 verses? And those are the verses with which he introduces the story of Jesus' miraculous birth. What's his story? What's he trying to communicate? Matthew was quite convinced that Jesus was of God. Matthew was convinced that in the life of Jesus, he believed he experienced the presence of the Holy One. But even if he wasn't born miraculously, Matthew was saying, I want you to know that God can work through any human distortion and any human sin to bring about the divine will. If you want to argue about whether Jesus' birth was holy, let me tell you it doesn't matter, because God can work through incest and prostitution and seduction and adultery to bring about the divine will.